Imagine this. A man stands before the British Parliament. He pulls out a jar. Inside, floating in pickling spirits, is a shriveled, severed human ear. He holds it up, and the room erupts. This isn't a scene from a horror movie. It's the real-life event that kicked off a war between two of the world's most powerful empires. This is the bizarre and incredible story of the War of Jenkins' Ear. Our story begins in 1731, on the high seas of the Caribbean. The air is thick with tension between Great Britain and Spain. Dade signed a treaty allowing Britain to trade in Spanish colonies, but only under very strict limits. British merchants, ever the opportunists, constantly pushed these boundaries, engaging in widespread smuggling. The Spanish, in response, dispatched their own coast guard, the Guardacostas, to patrol the waters and crack down on this illegal trade. It's here we meet Captain Robert Jenkins, the master of the British brig, Rebecca Moole. While sailing near Havana, his ship was stopped and boarded by the Spanish vessel La Isabela, commanded by Captain Julio Leon Fendico. Fendico and his crew accused Jenkins of smuggling, which, to be fair, he probably was. The search turned hostile. Accounts differ on the exact sequence of events, but they all end the same way. In a moment of brutal punishment, Fendico allegedly tied Jenkins to a mast, drew his sword, and sliced off his left ear. He then, according to Jenkins, mockingly told him, "Go, and tell your king that I will do the same." If he dares to do the same, Fendico then handed the severed ear back to its owner. Jenkins, ever the resourceful sailor, picked up his ear and preserved it in a jar of brine. For 7 long years, this gruesome souvenir sat on a shelf, a quiet testament to a personal humiliation. Jenkins went back to his life at sea, and the incident was largely forgotten by the public. But back in Britain, political tides were turning. A powerful opposition faction in Parliament was hungry for a confrontation with Spain. They saw Spanish control of the seas as a threat to Britain's growing commercial power and imperial ambitions. They just needed a symbol, a story so outrageous it would ignite public fury and force the government's hand. Then, in 1738, they remembered Captain Jenkins. He was summoned to appear before a committee of the House of Commons. And this is where our story's most iconic moment happens. Jenkins stands before the politicians, tells his harrowing tale, and dramatically produces the jar containing his pickled ear. The effect was electric. Whether the ear was truly his or just a prop hardly mattered. The story was perfect. Newspapers ran with it, printing sensationalized accounts and dramatic illustrations. The public was outraged. How dare the Spanish mutilate an Englishman? Cries of "Remember Jenkins' ear" echoed through the streets of London. Pressure on Prime Minister Robert Walpole became immense. Walpole was a man who preferred peace and diplomacy, understanding that war was costly and unpredictable. He had spent years trying to de-escalate tensions with Spain. But the war-hungry faction, fueled by public anger, painted him as weak and cowardly. They wanted to seize Spanish territory, protect British smugglers, and assert naval dominance. The story of Jenkins' ear was the final push they needed. Facing political ruin, if he resisted further, a reluctant Walpole finally gave in. In October 1739, Great Britain officially declared war on Spain, all because of one man and his dismembered ear. The war began with a bang for the British. Admiral Edward Vernon, a vocal proponent of the war, was sent to the Caribbean with a fleet. He promised Parliament he could capture the key Spanish silver port of Portobello in Panama with just 6 ships, and he did. In November 1739, Vernon launched a swift and successful attack. The Spanish garrison was caught off guard, and the city fell with minimal British casualties. The victory was a massive propaganda coup back home. Rule Britannia was composed to celebrate the triumph, and Vernon became a national hero. Towns and streets were named after him, and his face was plastered on everything from coins to pub signs. It seemed like the war would be a quick and glorious affair for the British. But this early success bred overconfidence, spurred on by the victory at Portobello. The British planned their most ambitious operation yet, an assault on the jewel of the Spanish Main, the heavily fortified city of Cartagena de Indias, in modern-day Colombia. It was one of the most important ports in the Spanish Empire, and its capture would be a devastating blow. In 1741, Britain assembled one of the largest amphibious forces ever seen, with over 180 ships and nearly 30,000 men, including a contingent of American colonists under Lawrence Washington, George Washington's half-brother. Waiting for them at Cartagena was a figure who would become a legend in Spanish history, Admiral Don Bladalezo. He was a hardened veteran, a man who had already lost a leg, an eye, and the use of an arm in previous battles, earning him the nickname Medio Hombre, or Half-Man. Despite his physical limitations, his mind was as sharp as ever. He was a brilliant defensive strategist, and he commanded a force that was vastly outnumbered by the British invaders. The British assault on Cartagena was a catastrophe. They managed to breach the outer defenses, but their attack on the main fortress of San Felipe de Barayas was a disaster. Poor planning, disease, and the dogged brilliant defense led by Bladalezo decimated the British ranks. Tropical diseases like yellow fever and dysentery swept through the British camps, killing more men than the Spanish cannons ever could. After weeks of brutal fighting and staggering losses, a humiliated Admiral Vernon was forced to withdraw. It was one of the most decisive defeats in the history of the Royal Navy. Bladalezo, the half-man, had saved the Spanish Empire's most vital port against overwhelming odds. Tragically, he would die from disease himself shortly after the battle. But his heroic defense cemented his legacy as one of Spain's greatest military heroes. After the disaster at Cartagena, the War of Jenkins' Ear lost its distinct identity. The conflict in the Americas sputtered on with smaller-scale raids and blockades, but the main focus soon shifted. In 1740, the War of the Austrian Succession had broken out in Europe. A much larger and more complex conflict involving all the major European powers. The War of Jenkins' Ear was effectively absorbed into this wider war. Britain and Spain continued to fight each other, but now as part of larger alliances on a global stage. The fighting spread from the Caribbean to Italy and the Netherlands. The war finally ended in 1748 with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, and after all the bloodshed, what was the result? Remarkably little. The treaty essentially returned things to the way they were before the war. The core issues of trade rights and smuggling that had started the conflict were left unresolved. Britain made no significant territorial gains from Spain in the Americas. In the end, thousands of lives had been lost, fortunes had been spent, and empires had clashed, all to achieve a stalemate. And what of Robert Jenkins, the man whose ear started it all? He was given command of another ship and continued his career, eventually ending up as an official at the British East India Company. He faded back into the obscurity from which he had been so dramatically plucked. The war that bore his name became a strange footnote in history, a conflict overshadowed by the larger wars that surrounded it. Yet, its legacy is fascinating. It stands as a powerful reminder of how public opinion, political opportunism, in a single, potent symbol in this case, a pickled ear in a jar, can plunge nations into conflict. It's a bizarre but true story of how personal injury became a pretext for imperial ambition, launching a war that would rage across the globe. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible tales from history. See you next time.